31st. The weather was horrible, and the emperor found great difficulty in going to Madame de Monttalon's saloon. He amused himself for some time in reading The 1001 Nights, and afterwards perceiving a volume of the Moniteur in which Monsieur de Monttalon was then employed, and which lay open in the part relative to the negotiations for maritime armistice in 1800. His whole attention was absorbed by them for upwards of an hour. After dinner, the emperor read first La Mère Coupable, in which we felt interested, and next the Melanie of La Harpe, which he thought wretchedly conceived and very badly executed. It was, he said, a turgid declamation in perfect conformity with the taste of the times, founded in fashionable calumnies and absurd falsehoods. When La Harpe wrote that piece, a father certainly had not the power of forcing his daughter to take the veil. The laws would have never allowed it. This play, which was performed at the beginning of the Revolution, was solely indebted for its success to the momentary caprice of public opinion. Now that the inducement is over, it would be a wretched performance. La Harpe's characters are all unnatural. He should not have attacked defective institutions with defective weapons. The emperor said that La Harpe had so completely failed in his object with regard to his own impressions that all his feelings were in favor of the father, while he was shocked at the daughter's conduct. He had never seen the performance without being tempted to start from his seat and call out to the daughter, "You have but to say no, and we will all take your part. You will find a protector in every citizen." He observed that when he was on service with his regiment, he had often witnessed the ceremony of taking the veil. It was a ceremony very much attended by the officers, and which raised our indignation, particularly when the victims were handsome. We ran in crowds to it, and our attention was alive to the slightest incident. Had they but said no, we should have carried them off sword in hand. It is consequently false that violence was employed. The only means used were the acts of seduction. Those upon whom they were practiced were kept not unlike recruits. They were exposed to the blandishments and exhortations of the nuns, the abbess, the spiritual director, and the bishop, to the examination of the civil officer, and finally to public view. Thus everything seemed to concur in prevailing upon them to make the sacrifice. The emperor declared that he was an enemy to convents in general, as useless and productive of degrading inactivity. He allowed, however, in another point of view, that certain reasons might be pleaded in their favor, the best mezzo termina, and he had adopted it. It was, in his opinion, that of tolerating them, of obligating the members to become useful, and of recognizing annual vows alone. The emperor complained that he had not been allowed time enough to complete his institutions. It had been his intention to enlarge the establishments of Saint-Denis and Écouen for the purpose of giving asylum to the widows of soldiers or women advanced in years. And then he added, it must also be allowed that there were characters and imaginations of all kinds, that compulsion ought not to be used with regard to persons of an eccentric turn, provided their oddities were harmless, and that an empire like France might and had a right to have houses for madmen called trappistes. With respect to the latter, he observed that if anyone ever thought of inflicting upon others the discipline which they practiced, it would be justly considered a most abominable tyranny, and that it might, notwithstanding, constitute the delight of him who voluntarily exercised it upon himself. This is man. These his fantastical pursuits are his folly. He had tolerated the monks of Mount Cenis, but these at least, he added, were useful, very useful, and might even be called heroical. The emperor expressed himself in his council of state in the following words when the organization of the university was about to take place. It is my opinion that the monks would be far the best body for communicating instruction were it possible to keep them under proper control and to shake off their dependence upon a foreign master. I am disposed to be favorable to them. I should perhaps have had the power to reinstate them in their establishments, but They have made the thing impossible. The moment I do anything for the clergy, they give me cause to repent it. I do not complain of the old established clergy, for with them I am sufficiently satisfied. But the young priests are brought up in a gloomy, fanatical doctrine. There is nothing Gallican in the young clergy. I have nothing to say against the ancient old bishops. They have shown themselves grateful for what I did for religion. They have realized my expectations. Cardinal de Boischelin was a man of sense, a virtuous character, who had faithfully adopted me. The Archbishop of Tours, a man of great acquirements, and who was of essential service to us in our differences with the Pope, was always very much attached to me. The worthy Cardinal de Belloy was the virtuous Bishop of Roquelaure, had a sincere affection for me. I made no difficulty whatever in placing Bishop Beausset among the dignitaries of the university, and I am convinced that he was one of those who, in that capacity, most sincerely conducted themselves in conformity with my views. All these ancient bishops possessed my confidence, and none of them deceived me. It is not a little singular that those I had the greatest cause to complain of were precisely those whom I had chosen myself. So very true is it that the holy unction in approximating us to heaven does not deliver us from the infirmities of the earth, from its irregularities, its obscenities, its turpitudes. The conversation next turned upon the want of priests in France, on the obligation of employing them at the age of 16, and the difficulty, even the impossibility of finding any at 21. It was the emperor's wish that they should be ordained at a more advanced age. The answer of the bishops and the Pope himself was, "It is very well, your reasons are very just, but if you wait for that period, you will find none to ordain, and yet you admit that you are in want of them. I have no doubt," observed the emperor, "that after me other principles will be adopted. A conscription of priests and nuns will perhaps be seen in France as a military conscription was seen in my time. The barracks will perhaps be turned into convents and seminaries. Thus the world runs on. Poor people, in spite of all your knowledge, all your wisdom, you continue like simple individuals, the slaves of fashionable caprice." It was nearly 1 o'clock in the morning before the emperor retired. It was, he said, a real victory over tediousness and a great relief for the want of sleep. August 1st. The weather was dreadful. About 3 o'clock, the Grand Marshal came to look for me, but as I had at that moment ventured out, I was not to be found. It was on account of some English whom he had to present to the emperor. The emperor sent for me at 5. He was in a bad humor, and not a little so, he said, on my account. The visit of the English, the bad weather, the want of the saloon, and an interpreter had all combined to vex him. He was reading the Vieilles du Chateau, which he observed were tiresome, and he left them for the tales of Margaret, Queen of Navarre. He afterwards reverted to Versailles, the court, the queen, Madame Campan, and the king were the principal subjects of his remarks, and he said many things, some of which I have already noticed. He concluded with observing that Louis XVI would have been a perfect pattern in private life, but that he had been a wretched king, and that the queen would now no doubt have been at all times the ornament of every circle, but that her levity, her inconsistencies, and want of capacity had not a little contributed to promote and accelerate the catastrophe. She had, he remarked, arranged the manners of Versailles. Its ancient gravity and strict etiquette were transformed into the free and easy prettiness and absolute tittle-tattle of a private party. No man of sense and importance could avoid the jests of the young courtiers, whose natural disposition for raillery was sharpened by the applause of a young and beautiful sovereign. One of the most characteristic anecdotes of that day was told. A gallant and worthy German general arrived at Paris with a special recommendation to the queen on the part of the Emperor Joseph, her brother. The queen thought she could not do him a great favor than that of inviting him to one of her private parties. He found himself, it may be easily imagined, a little out of his element in such company, but it was everyone's wish to treat him with marked respect, and he was obliged to take a leading part of the conversation. He was unfortunate in the selection of his topics and in his manner of introducing them. He talked a great deal about his white mare and his great mare, upon which he said at the highest value. The subject gave rise to a number of arch inquiries on the part of the young courtiers respecting 1,000 frivolous points, which he had the good nature to answer as if they were matters of importance. In conclusion, one of them asked which of the two he preferred. Really, answered the general, with particular significance, I must confess that if I were in the day of battle on my white mare, I do not believe I should dismount to get on my gray one. At length he made his bow, and the bursts of laughter that followed may be easily conceived. The conversation took another turn after his departure. The attractions of white and brown beauties were long and ingeniously canvassed, and the queen having asked one of the party which he preferred, he instantly assumed a grave air, and imitating the solemn tone of the Austrian, answered, "Really, madame, I must confess that if I were in the day of battle on blank." "Enough," observed the queen. "Spare us the remainder." After dinner, he read Beverley and the Père de Famille to us. The latter in particular excited his animadversion. To us it seemed a paltry production. What most amused the emperor, as he said, was that it belonged to Diderot, that Corypheus of the philosophers, and encyclopedia. All it contained was, he said, false and ridiculous. The emperor entered into a long examination of the details and concluded with saying, "Why reasoneth a madman in the height of a raging fever? It is remedies and a decisive mode of treatment of which he stands in need. Who does not know that the only safeguard against love is flight? When Mentor wishes to secure Telemachus, he plunges him into the sea. When Ulysses endeavors to preserve himself from the sirens, he gets himself tied fast after having stopped the ears of his companions with wax." The second, uninterrupted bad weather with heavy rains. The emperor was not well. He felt his nerves very much irritated. He sent for me to breakfast with him. During the whole of breakfast and a long time afterwards, the conversation again turned on the emigration. I have already remarked that he often brought me back to the subject. His inquiries today were directed to the particulars of what had passed at Coblentz, to our situation, our disposition, our organization, our views, and our resources. And at the end of all my answers, he concluded, observing, "You've already several times acquainted me with a considerable part of those things, and yet I do not retain them, because you communicate them without regularity, reduce them to a consistent historical summary. How could you be better employed in this place? And then, my dear Las Casas, you will have a piece ready at hand for your journal." It was Dido's demand of Aeneas, and I, too, might have exclaimed, "Infandum regina jubes blank." I executed, however, the sketches completely, as my memory and judgment enabled me, for the subject began to grow stale, and I was at that time very young. I give it as I read it, a short time afterwards, to Napoleon. "Sire, after the famous events which overthrew the Bastille and set all France in agitation, most of our princes who found themselves implicated in the consequences fled from the country with the sole view at that period of securing their personal safety. They were soon after joined by personals of considerable rank and by a number of young men, the former induced by the relations which they had with them, and the latter by a persuasion that the measure of itself indicated in some degree a striking, generous, and decided devotedness. When a certain number were collected, the idea suggested itself of converting to a political end that which until then had been produced by zeal and chance alone. It was thought that if, with the assistance of these junctions, a kind of small power could be created, it might be enabled to react with advantage on the interior, become a lever there to insurrection, make an impression on the public mind, and restrain popular commotion, while it would be without a title or pretext for applying to foreign powers and claiming their attention. This was the origin of the emigration, and it is confidently stated that this grand idea was conceived by Monsieur de Calonne as he passed through Switzerland in the suite of one of our princes who was on his way from Turin to Germany. The first meeting was held at Worms under the Prince de Condé. The most celebrated was at Coblentz under the king's two brothers, one of whom came from Italy, where he had at first found an asylum in the court of the king of Sardinia, his father-in-law, and the other arrived by the way at Brussels after escaping the arrests which had made a captive of Louis XVI at Varennes. I was one of the first to assemble at Worms. The number about the prince was scarcely 50 when I arrived in the entire effervescence of youth, and with the first inspiration of what was noble, I hastened to Worms. With the most innocent simplicity of heart, my reading and my prayer each morning consisted of a chapter of Bayard. I expected, on reaching Worms, to be at the very least seized and embraced by so many brothers in arms, but to my great surprise, and it was my first lesson in mankind, instead of this affectionate reception, I and a companion were all at once examined and observed for the purpose of having ascertained that we were not spies. We were afterwards carefully sounded with regard to our interest, our views, and the pretensions by which we might have been actuated. And finally, great pains were taken to prove to us and to make the prince perceive, and this plan was renewed on every fresh arrival, that our numbers increased greatly and exceeded, no doubt already, the places and favors he had to confer. My companion was so shocked that he proposed to me to return instantly to Paris. We who composed the assemblage, in order to make ourselves useful or to acquire importance, undertook, 3 or 4 of us by turns, to form a kind of regular guard about the prince's person night and day, for we dreamt already but of conspiracies and assassinations so very powerful and redoubtable did we think ourselves, and when relieved on this kind of voluntary guard, we had the honor of being admitted to the prince's table. 3 generations of Condé constituted the glory of the family, a singular circumstance which was renewed with a more striking effect in the army of the Condé, in which the grandfather fought in the center, while the son and grandson commanded the right and the left, where they were, I believe, both wounded. And on the same day, the Prince of Monaco had followed the Prince of Condé. He married her afterwards, but she then governed and did the honors of his establishment. We had the opportunity of hearing at that table some of the guests assert and reassert to the prince that we were already more than enough to enter France, and that his name and a white handkerchief were sufficient, that the star of Condé was about to shine forth once more, that the occasion was singularly happy, and that it was necessary to seize upon it. And I would not pledge myself that adulation was not pushed so far as to suggest very interested personal views to the prince. Worms, from the nature of its meeting and the character of its chief, always evinced more regularity, more austerity of discipline than Koblenz, where there was a display of more agitation, luxury, and pleasure. Worms was accordingly called the camp, and Koblenz the town, or the court. The importance of the leader was in proportion to the force under his command, and of this the Prince of Condé was so sensible that he never saw anyone leave him without regret, and remembered it a long time. I was not on that account the less eager to go to Koblenz the moment it acquired a certain degree of splendor. I had relations and friends there, and it was besides more attractive by greater magnificence, activity, and grandeur. Koblenz became in a short time a focus of foreign and domestic intrigues. 2 distinct parties might be observed there. Messieurs Avaray de Jaucourt and some others were the confidential friends, the advisors, or the ministers of Monsieur, now Louis XVIII, the Bishop of Arras, the Count de Vaudreuil, and others were those of Monseigneur the Comte d'Artois, and it was confidently stated that even then these princes manifested distinctly through the same political differences which, it is pretended, have since characterized them. Monsieur Berteuil, resident at Brussels and charged according to his own declaration with unlimited powers by Louis XVI, had formed a third party and added to the complication of our affairs. Monsieur de Calonne was relied on for our financial department, and the old Marshal de Broglie and the Marshal de Castries were at the head of our military establishment. The brave and able Monsieur de Bouilly, who had left France after the affair of Rennes, found it impossible to remain with us and followed King Gustavus III to Sweden. The emigration had, however, assumed a grand character thanks to the care employed for its propagation. Agents had traversed the provinces, circulars had been distributed in the mansions and country seats, summoning every gentleman to join the princes and act in cooperation with them for the security of the altar and the throne, the revenge of their honor, and the recovery of their rights. The absolute crusade had been preached, and with so much more effect as it made an impression on minds disposed to attend to it. Among the whole of the nobility and privileged classes, there was not a single person who did not feel himself cut to the quick by the decrees of the assembly. All from him who filled the highest rank to the lowest country squire had been deprived of what they held most dear. For the former had lost his title and his vassals, and the latter had seen his turret and his pigeon house insulted and his hares shot. Accordingly, the movement to begin the journey was immediate and universal. It could not be abandoned under the penalty of dishonor, and the women were directed to send spindles to those who hesitated or were too tardy, whether then from passion and pusillanimity or a point of honor. The emigration became a real infection. Multitudes rushed furiously beyond the frontiers, and what contributed not a little to increase evil was the means employed by the leaders of the revolution to promote it in secret, while they affected to oppose it in public. They declaimed in vague terms against it from the tribune. It is true, but they took great care that all the passages should be left open. Did the zeal of the emigrants slacken, the declaimers became more violent, and it was decided that the barriers should be strictly guarded. Then those who had been left behind were reduced to despair because they had not taken advantage of the favorable moment, but accidentally or from inattention, the barriers were again open, and they were passed with eagerness by those who were determined not to expose themselves to another disappointment. It was by this dexterous management that the assembly assisted its enemies in plunging themselves into the abyss. The able men of the faction had, from the beginning, conceived that such a measure would deliver them from the heterogeneous parties that checked their progress, and that the property of all these voluntary exiles would secure to them incalculable resources. The officers thought they did wonders in stealing away from their regiments, while the leaders of the revolution on their part excited the soldiers to revolt in order to force them into it. They got rid by these means of enemies who were highly dangerous, and obtained, on the contrary, in the non-commissioned officers, zealous cooperators who became heroes in the national cause. It was they who furnished great captains and who beat all the veteran troops of foreign powers. The consequence was that Coblentz collected all that was illustrious belonging to the court in France, and all that was opulent and distinguished belonging to the provinces. We were thousands, consisting of every branch, uniform, and rank in the army. We peopled the town and overran the palace. Our daily assemblages about the persons of the princes seemed like so many splendid festivals. The court was most brilliant, and our princes were so effectually its sovereigns that the poor elector was eclipsed and lost in the midst of us, which induced a person to observe to him very pleasantly one day, whether from perfect simplicity or keen raillery, that among all those who thronged his palace, he was the only stranger. During the grand solemnities, we occasionally had public galas, and the respectable inhabitants were permitted to take a view of the tables. We then exulted at witnessing the admiration expressed by the public of the country for the pleasing countenance and chivalrous appearance of Monseigneur the Comte d'Artois, and we were proud of the homage paid by them to the acquirements and talents of Monsieur. It was worthwhile to see with what arrogance we paraded with us, as it were, the whole dignity, the luster of our monarchy, and above all, the superiority of our sovereign and the elevation of our princes. His Majesty the King was the expression which we pompously used in the German circles to designate the King of France, for that was, or ought to be, in our opinion, his title and point of preeminence with respect to all Europe. The Abbé Marie, whom he had at first received with acclamation, but who by the by lost much of our esteem in a very short time, had discovered, he assured us, that such was his right and his prerogative. Shall I give another instance of overweening pride and conceit? At a latter period, during our great disasters, and when our cause was completely ruined, an Austrian officer of superior rank, charged with dispatches for the court of London, invited to dinner several of our officers with whom he had formerly been connected on the continent. After dinner, and very near the time when every truth comes out, the company began to talk politics, and he happened to say that on his departure from Vienna, one of the principal subjects of conversation was the marriage of Madame Royale, now Duchess d'Angoulême, with the Archduke Charles, who at that moment enjoyed great celebrity. But it is impossible, observed one of his French guests. And why? Because it is not a suitable marriage for Madame. How? Exclaimed the Austrian, seriously offended and almost breathless. His Royal Highness, Monseigneur, the Archduke Charles, not a suitable marriage for your princess? Oh, no, sir. It would be but a garrison marriage for her. Besides, these lofty pretensions were instilled into us with our education. They belonged to us as national sentiments, and our princes were not exempt from them. With us, the king's brothers disdained the title of Royal Highness. They had the pretension of addressing all the sovereigns by the title of brother. The rest of the system was carried on in a proportionate way, and there was accordingly but one feeling in Europe against our Versailles manners and the presumption of our princes. Gustavus III said at Aix-la-Chapelle, "Your court of Versailles was not accessible. It indulged too much in haughtiness and ridicule. When I was there was scarcely any attention paid to me, and when I left it, I brought away the titles of booby and blockhead." The Duchess of Cumberland, who was married to the King of England's brother, had to complain at the same time and in the same city that the Prince de Lamballe did not grant her the honors of the folding doors. The old Duke of Gloucester complained on his own account at a later period in London of one of our princes of the blood, and added that the Prince of Wales left heartily because he, the Prince of Wales, addressing the same prince by the title of Monseigneur, the latter studiously endeavored to model his language so as to not return the compliment. At Coblentz, however, when our circumstances were altered, our princes condescended to change their manners in that respect, and they let themselves down to the level of foreign princes. They were then with the Elector of Treves, a prince of Saxony, their mother's brother, whom by way of parenthesis we were at that time eating up, and who was afterwards deprived of his possessions on our account. They condescended to call him their uncle, and he was allowed to call him his nephews. It is confidently stated that he said to them one day, "It is to your misfortune that I am indebted to such affectionate expressions. At Versailles, you would have treated me as plain old Monsieur l'Abbé, and it is not certain that you would have received my visits every day." It was added that he spoke the truth, and that they had given me melancholy proofs of it to his brother, the Count de Lusace, who was present.